Welcome to the Politecnico of Turin. We are here in the hall called Sala Consiglio di Facoltà, here in the main premises of the Politecnic in Turin in Corso Duca degli Abruzzi. I'm Juan Carlos De Martin. I'm the Vice Rector for Culture and Communications and also the co-director of the Nexus Center for Internet and Society. And it's a great pleasure to be here today, both in presence and also online, to present, discuss a book by a colleague and friend, if I may so, Viktor Mayer-Schönberger, a book that he co-written with Thomas Ramge, if I pronounce it correctly, which has been published in Italy by Egea Bocconi. I would say the title in Italian is Fuori, dati, punto esclamativo, rompere i monopoli sulle informazioni per rilanciare il progresso. It's a book addressed to the general public, so anybody interested in our contemporary world, I would say, and the crucial role that data play in the contemporary world, and more specifically in our socio-economic system. Viktor Mayer-Schönberger is a professor at the University of Oxford and is associated with the Oxford Internet Institute. He has written a number of influential books on topics that are directly connected to the one of the book that we present today, starting with the book, maybe the most influential book regarding big data that goes back almost a decade ago, and then several other books about the delete, about the oblivion related to data and search engines, our economic systems, the rethinking of capitalism, etc., etc. So it's a great pleasure to have him here at the Polytechnic, and the meeting will last about, at this point, approximately 1 hour, and the plan is that Professor Mayer-Schönberger will present a brief overview, or not brief, it's up to him, of the book, and then we will have a conversation starting with my colleague, Professor Alessandro Mantelero, a law professor that is who is a well-known international expert on topics connected to digital technologies. There's a long list of collaborations that I will skip, but going back from the Council of Europe to national bodies. So Professor Alessandro Mantelero is, I think it's a perfect discussant for the conversation that we're going to have today. So having said, and maybe at the end I will say a few words too about the content of this timely book. Having said that, allow me to give the microphone to Professor Mayer-Schönberger, and welcome to Torino and to the Polytechnic.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. It is a great pleasure to be here in Torino and to be flanked by Alessandro and Juan Carlos. Juan Carlos, when we met for the first time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I was just writing Delete, the Virtue of Forgetting, and then Alessandro, when you came to Oxford, it was just big data. So now it is just perfectly timely that I am here to talk about this particular book and the very precarious situation that we find ourselves in right now. In fact, I believe that our economy and our society are the most important and the most challenging point in the last 200 years. And that has to do with, in part, but in large part, has to do with what we see is a huge concentration of information, knowledge, and data among a very small number of organizations and companies. Sometimes they are called the online platforms. I don't like the word platform at all because it sounds so nice. You know, they are called big tech in the United States in a slightly disparaging way, and I prefer that. What we see is that big tech is sucking huge amounts of data and bunkering that data and using it to create enormous amounts of monopoly rents from that data, while at the same time in Europe we are providing them with the data, but our small and medium enterprises, our startups and our entrepreneurs have great ideas but can't realize those ideas because they don't have enough access to data. And the book tries to address this very severe situation in the august halls of Brussels and Paris and Rome and Berlin. The politicians run around and wonder whether Europe has to pick a side between the total commercialization of data, as we see from the Silicon Valley on the one hand, and the mercantilist approach in China, where a lot of data is being collected from abroad in order to further the own economic growth and progress of their own big tech companies. And then Europe is being asked to choose from these two options, or to go for a path of ignorance and forego the ability to collect and utilize data and to cherish the value of forgetting, deletion, and ignorance, and hope that that will create a better future. I believe that this is the wrong analysis and this is the wrong solution. For the analysis first. The first misconception is that we think that this is a market problem, that the market concentration alone is the problem. It isn't. Market concentration is one problem, but there is a bigger one. And the bigger one has to do with the very process of innovation. Innovation is the lifeblood, not just of the economy, but also of our society. Without innovation, we will not be able to rise up to the challenges we are facing, whether it's global warming and climate change, whether it's social and economic inequalities, whether it's a rise in populism or a change in the structure of our economy. All of these challenges are very significant, and what we need is innovation. That is, we need ideas, social innovation, economic innovation, technical innovation. We need ideas and put those ideas into practice. Unfortunately, at precisely the moment where we need to be innovative, we can't. And we have lost our ability to innovate. And that has to do not with our inability to come up with good ideas, but that has to do with the fact that good ideas are no longer sufficient. A lot of times today we, in order to produce innovation, need a good idea and then need data to train an AI or a machine learning system in order to move the good idea into an actual innovation. To the extent that these European companies don't have access to the data, they can take all of the good ideas and don't do anything with it. Almost 100 years ago, a famous economist by the name of Joseph Schumpeter, who coined the term creative destruction and was really focused on innovation, he worried already about this problem, the problem of an innovation concentration. He feared that innovation would be concentrated in a small number of very large companies, but he feared it would happen because capital was concentrated. Capital wasn't available to the startup companies. Fortunately, he was wrong, because venture capital came about, but also very large government programs like the European Recovery Program, ERP, that furthered and facilitated, for example, the German Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle, by making capital available, particularly to small and medium enterprises. So Schumpeter was wrong about the role of capital, or the inability, inavailability of capital. But he was right about worrying of the accessibility of resources, because now, today, the problem isn't accessibility of capital. The problem is accessibility of data. And so when we want to enable European economy and enable European societies to be innovative again, what we need to do is not to have them come up with better ideas. There are already a lot of good ideas out there. But we need to facilitate the flow of data, information, and knowledge. And that is crucial in our society. And that means we need to actually go to those that have a lot of data and force them to open their data troves and let others access it. Please keep in mind, I am not advocating expropriation. I'm not advocating to take anything away from Google or Amazon or Facebook. They can keep their data and they can use it as much as they want, as long as they let others access the data as well. Of course, I'm not talking about personal data. I'm talking about non-personal or machine data that's not personalized in nature, has been depersonalized. And most of the data today that is being collected is actually non-personal. It might sound strange if we all think about e-commerce and what Google and Amazon knows about us. But if you think about the total amount of data that machines in IoT and Industry 4.0 generate, it's non-personal data that's very valuable and that's underutilized. It's terribly underutilized because 85% of the data that is being collected in Europe is not even used once. So we spend a lot of time collecting data and then put it in the basement and forget about it. It's ridiculous. It's unsustainable. You know, just imagine we would have a resource that we mine at great cost and then throw 85% away and only keep 15%. It almost sounds like gasoline engines. Oh, we have that too. I forgot. But we clearly need to move towards a path of sustainability. And that means utilizing the data troves that we have rather than letting big tech in America utilize it. For that, we need a mandate, a legal mandate, a law that opens up access to data. And we have had similar laws already in open data in the public sector, but we also have and had similar laws for 200 years. Think of patent law. The very idea of patent law, everybody says is, exclusive right for the patent holder. But that's only half of it. The other half that we often forget is that in order to get a patent, you need to specify and to put in the open your invention in the patent application so that everybody can look at it and everybody can learn from it. It's this kind of fundamental sharing of data and knowledge and information that's been part and parcel not just of our patent system, but part and parcel of our democracy and of our market economy. We need to bring that back, and with doing that, we create a third way for Europe that gives an opportunity for Europe to build on what Europe was rightly known for 200, 250, maybe 300 years. And that is enlightenment. Understanding the world a little better by looking at it, by examining it, and based on that, making better decisions. That's a true element of European DNA, and if we focus on that, and if we build on that, we can develop a future that is being data facilitated towards a better understanding of the challenges we face and a better imagination of the solutions that are possible. That's what we need to do. I believe that European as well as national governments in Europe are taking first steps in this direction. now is the time to act, and we can't miss this opportunity.
Thank you so much for this overview of the main message of this book. And I would like now to give the microphone to Alessandro Mantelero, my colleague here at the Politecnico. Please, Alessandro.
Thank you very much. It's for me a pleasure to be here with Viktor, and we met several times, and a few times in Italy at the end. And one time was in Florence when you presented Delete in Florence. And I remember an interesting discussion with Viktor during the conference, I think it was in Austria maybe, about the history and the evolution of data protection in Europe. And this is to mention that Viktor, although over the last year focused on this broad perspective, is a true privacy scholar at the end, because your first book and research was on the original development of data protection law. And in this sense, in your book you mentioned the religion of the protection of data. And of course, the title is to emphasize some issues that are related to data protection. But I think that you touch an important point. There is a sort of contradiction, because we focus on the protection data mainly on the basis of consent. But this tool, at the end, make it possible to collect large, extensive, very extensive silos of data in a very proprietary way at the end. And not in line with the self-determination that was a traditional idea in data protection. And this is also in some new theory that look at new property approach to data protection, for instance, to personal data. And in this sense, the GDPR and the European approach to data regulation is something that can enable, in your opinion, you mentioned the virtue of forgetting and the virtue of sharing, is something that can enable the virtue of sharing? Because at the end, in the first article, there is protection of personal data and the free flows of information. So where is the problem in this system that apparently is open to the freedom of information, but in the end make it possible to create these large silos? So from a regulatory perspective, what is the main problem of this religion in data protection in Europe? Thank you.
That requires a look back in history. When data protection came into being, the very early experts rightly looked at the data processors and said we need to regulate the data processors because they are creating the profit, they should also be regulated. In fact, that's what we are doing everywhere. You know, when we're purchasing a car and it topples over, then of course we are going after the car manufacturer. When we go to the grocery store, to the supermarket and purchase groceries, we don't bring our own chemistry lab to test the groceries there before we purchase them. We believe that there is regulation in place, we believe that there is processes in place, and we believe that there is institutions in place to take care of that, and so it's safe for us to purchase what's on offer there. Only on the internet we don't do that. On the internet we have, for some strange reasons, opted to put all of the responsibility on the shoulders of the individual. The individual is tasked with the very difficult choice of either clicking OK and consenting or not clicking OK after having to read dozens of pages of terms of services that are written by lawyers who obfuscate what is actually going on and that describe complicated technical processes. This, of course, is not empowering the individual, and the individual really doesn't care. Much like we don't want or don't need to be chemistry majors to go to the grocery store. We don't need to be computer scientists, or should not need to be computer scientists to have our data protection protected, our privacy protected. However, GDPR works in that way, and that's highly problematic because it creates a data protection theater. It creates the formalistic view that we have strong data protection in Europe, when in actuality we don't, and the very large companies still, American companies still rule the world. And it gets even worse because if you look more closely at GDPR, you find out that in the fine print of GDPR, it is very difficult to collect data. You need to get consent. But once you have collected the data, you can repurpose the data very easily, as long as you're using statistical purposes or statistical tools to do that. That violates a fundamental principle of data protection guidelines, the purpose limitation principle, but nevertheless made it into GDPR. So again, GDPR looks great from the outside, but is actually data protection theater. What we need to protect our privacy is responsibility of those that process information. At the same time, an encouragement and a facilitation of the usage, the responsible usage of data. And we don't have that in Europe, and that is a fundamental problem.
Thank you, Viktor. And I think that you touched this important point about personal data. So having an approach on personal data that consider the importance of the free flows of data, and maybe also a new framework for self-determination that is not necessarily based on consent, that is provided on based on something that you don't read, or if you read, you don't understand, or where you have no option. And on the other hand, if we look at non-personal data, that is the topic of your book, it seems that there is not a lot of attention. The regulator creates some nice piece of law, but at the end you mention some large-scale project that obtain some results. But if you look also to the experience on open data, we have few governmental data. For instance, in Italy, some data about tourism that are nice, but not necessarily so challenging. The most relevant also from economic perspective data are usually protected or used by by public entities through private channels, so monetized, basically. And the only project you mentioned, some projects, for instance, the CERN and the projects, are large-scale top-down projects at the end. But how we can change with a bottom-up approach to how we can convince that is important sharing data?
I think we have learned a lot in the pandemic. We've learned a lot in the pandemic on how bad the data is that we're actually collecting, how we have very few standards or standard taxonomies and ontologies to make sure that the same data, the same kind of data is immediately comparable. And oftentimes it isn't. We have seen it. We have seen it in issues like hospitalization rates throughout Europe and so forth, where there's different ways to count, or in case fatality rates for COVID, different ways to count, and that has, I think, driven very much the need to understand data in a broader context, that it requires not just a single act, but it requires also nurturing. It's data use as gardening, if I may say that, much like a gardener that requires who exercises constant care and who waters the plants and who provides seeds and so forth, we need to do the same thing for data use. We need to create an ecosystem around it. Let's face it, we tried open data in the public sector, but you know how this played out. The useless data was made publicly available, and all the valuable data was kept by the government agencies, oftentimes exclusively made available to some big tech companies. For example, in Germany, there is a mandate, a legal mandate, that the mobility companies, the public transport companies like subways, trams, buses, that they provide their scheduling information and real-time information to anybody who asks, so that there can be mobility apps and so forth, helping sustainability, helping the environment, and helping startups. Unfortunately, the reality is that most of those public transport companies only give the static scheduling data available. But the real-time data they give exclusively to Google. Why Google? Because Google pays them money. Simple and straightforward as that. Google has an exclusive deal to keep that most valuable, most useful data away from us, even though it's public transportation companies that our tax money funds. It's ridiculous. And there is a legal mandate for it. It's ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous, but it is the way that big tech and the various players have set up this situation. This needs to change, and we need to break through this very dangerous concentration of information, knowledge, and data.
Thank you. I have a last question that is connected to the last part of your book about sort of geopolitical approach, if you want, when you talk about digital colonialism. And in the context of digital colonialism, you touch the role of data, of course. We know, for instance, there are many companies active in Africa. Also, at the Oxford Internet Institute, there are a lot of research in this field. And this is a problem of data. Probably is also a problem of infrastructure, I think. And this, if you want, is also a bridge to your next book, Framers, that is about not only the information, but the way in which we imagine, in which we create the information. So, from this perspective, not only the free flow of data is important, but also a free mind in order to frame the data, frame the flow of data, and data plus infrastructure create the framework. Data per se, I think, is not enough, but we need something more. We need data, infrastructure, and a framework that have in mind what is the goal, I think.
Absolutely. When we talk about digital sovereignty, which is such a beautiful word that is always used, of course, many people, when they hear, we need to have digital sovereignty, they think about individual sovereignty. I am sovereign. Well, you're not, but individual sovereignty actually turns out isn't the big problem. The problem that we see is a digital sovereignty or a lack of digital sovereignty on a societal level. All of our society isn't sovereign anymore. When in the pandemic, in the early phases of the pandemic, remember back in March of 2020, we didn't know what the virus was, how it was infecting people and so forth. And so we were hoping that an app, perhaps on our smartphones, could help trace and track who we had been in contact with. Because it turns out tracing and tracking is actually pretty effective if it is done well. I remember as part of my advising the German government contacted Apple and contacted Google, and they said, you know, we are building this app. We need to access some of your internal system calls in order to create an app to help battle the pandemic. And Apple and Google said, you can't. We will not let you. And Macron said, who was also involved, but we are a sovereign nation. This is our data. And Google and Apple said, since when are you sovereign? What didn't you get? You can choose whether or not you're using your smartphone, but if you're using our smartphones, we make the rules, not you. It's us, not you. Wake up to this world. And what is this kind of world that we are living in when societies cannot choose for themselves, democratic societies cannot choose for themselves how their own data in a dangerous existential pandemic is being used? Then we lack what sovereignty is all about. And then we need to rethink whether or not we have digital sovereignty, not on an individual level, whether or not we can click OK on the GDPR screen, but whether on a societal level we have the capacity to really forge the path of our future. And so we need to rethink, in a way, the situation in our mind. We need to rethink what we mean with sovereignty. Alessandro, you're absolutely right. In Framers, the new book that came out in English just very recently, we make the argument that data is crucial, but that in order to do something with the data, you also need to have a mental concept of what to do with it. And it is important to be able to switch from one concept to another if that's necessary, because sometimes you're in the wrong concept. And we give the example of the United Kingdom and New Zealand, two islands that were battling the pandemic in the first wave. And they had exactly the same data, but they had two different approaches. New Zealand looked at the data and said, this virus is like SARS, because they remembered SARS, the earlier coronavirus outbreak about 10 years ago, and said, we immediately need to eliminate the virus, total lockdown, absolute elimination. 2 months later, they had eliminated the virus, and New Zealand was COVID-free. Same situation in Britain, same data. Government looked at it and said, this is like the flu or like the cold. We can't do anything about it. We can just get through with it, hope for the best. So they didn't track and trace. They didn't socially distance. They didn't close the schools. They didn't close the football stadiums. And so, boom! The epidemic mushroomed, and they only started to take countermeasures when their National Health Service was at the brink of total collapse. And by the time New Zealand was COVID-free, Britain had 50,000 COVID deaths. And that makes a huge difference. Same data, different point of view, different concept. So yes, I completely agree. We need our conception, and when we think about the role of data, we also need to reconceive what we mean with sovereignty, from an individual sovereignty that worked well to a societal sovereignty, which unfortunately we don't have today.
Okay, thank you, Alessandro and Viktor, for your replies too. And I've I try to summarize my one point related to your book and also related to what you just said. First of all, I agree. We have to open up these silos and make the data available, etc., etc. I've been saying that myself for quite some time, among other people, so of course I totally agree. However, I think it's a good reaction, meaning we have big tech, is mostly US-based as far as the Europe is concerned. So they are there, and we could enact a law to open up data as you described, fine. But I think we also need to be, and when you talk about the contact tracing application, you hint at that. We need to be also explicitly active in the sense that I think there is, if we really want to be sovereign, we really need to develop our own digital capabilities, both companies and state-based capabilities. In principle, Europe has the money, has the brains, with scientific capabilities, so it's not a matter that we lack these fundamental resources, but for a number of reasons, Europe in the last 75 years, because the first digital computer was 75 years ago, somehow either didn't get it in time, they focused on automobiles, and we're in Torino now, and on food, luxury, airplanes, so even high-tech stuff, but not so much digital. In Italy, I don't know in Germany or Austria, but in Italy for a long time we heard famous entrepreneurs and capitalists saying, we lost that battle. We had Olivetti here, remember?
I know.
So they were saying, we just buy what we need. We buy it from the US. Who cares? There is a market. We just buy it. And actually, you just mentioned that digital technologies, and we could say technologies in general, are not simple commodities. Even other kinds of advanced technology. Okay, we talk a lot about China, but China, until a few years ago, if they wanted to make a ballpoint pen, they couldn't do it. Because those tiny little spheres, they couldn't be produced locally. They had to import it. Now apparently they can. But even airplane jets, they cannot do advanced airplane jets. They have to buy it. And of course, it's not a market transaction, if you want to sell, if you can build jet engines, you can sell them to China, but it's much more a political and geopolitical decision than a market transaction. So going back to digital, Europe in principle could and therefore should develop technology, smartphones and all sorts of technologies. And apparently in the last maybe 12 months, even in Brussels that you often mention, starts to be understood that we need to be able to produce chips, we need our own transatlantic cables, we need operating systems, etc., etc. So that's the precondition to be actually sovereign. And I think it relates to US-Europe relationship at a very high level. So it would be interesting to see if Europe actually wants to go into that direction, exactly where actually, what point actually reaches. Two more comments connected to this one. Opening up big tech, fine, but also, even though they are omnivorous and try to get all the data they want, there are certain kinds of data that could be societally beneficial that they do not collect because they think it's not interesting. And so one point is, who's going to collect the data that is potentially society? Maybe the NGOs, maybe the association, maybe the state. And one final comment is that, and I think we mentioned that when we met a few years ago, I think that in some cases, data should not be collected. So one of the options on the table is that there are data that we do not want to collect in the first place. One example is facial recognition, and now has been more widely acknowledged that the solution is actually not collecting that kind of data. But it could be also other kinds of data that we don't want to even start the process of collecting the data.
If you permit me to just very briefly react to that. on the last point first, because it's the most obvious to me. Yes, of course, as we understand that data holds value, societal value, in addition to economic value, we also need to have a very spirited discussion in our society about where we want to be deliberately ignorant. And Delete, the book that I wrote first, is all about being deliberately ignorant about certain areas. Deliberately saying, no, not in that area, or not in that kind of data. And I think we need to have this debate in our society. And this is something that we need to, at multiple times, revisit. It's questions that we need to revisit. Things that may be innocuous one time may be very poisonous later on, and vice versa, by the way. And so we need to have a conversation about that. But we can only, I think, have that conversation really well if we all in our mindset understand that we are, in general, interested in using data, and therefore we are then creating these sort of zones of ignorance, deliberate zones of ignorance. I'm fully in agreement with you. I also agree with the other point that you made, and I just wanted to add one element to it that I struggle with, or I think is important. I think it would be wrong for Europe to try and rebuild or try and catch up with the past. I think what we need to focus on is kind of the future. So, for example, I am very reluctant to have Europe spend 100 billion euros on building commodified cloud service capabilities. But I would be extremely interested for Europe to become the world leader in quantum cryptography, or in cryptography, let me be even more precise, in random number generation, because all of cryptography requires random number generation. And if we in Europe had kind of the world's best random number generation, we would have the world's best ballpoint pen balls. And that is the kind of strategic bottleneck that we need to conquer. Similarly, we hear so much about chip foundries in China, TSMC and others, that built the latest chips, very advanced, better than Intel. But what is interesting is that those chip foundries use machines that are built in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands has the world's most advanced high energy lithography machines that are used for that. And so we, as Europe, need to identify those strategic elements, those strategic bottlenecks, and invest in them. That is far more important than spending 10 billion or 100 billion on a technology that is more commodified. I want Europe to be strategic in its bottleneck decision making, and that includes, in particular, creating public sector institutions that jump into the breach of data collection where data is not being collected by the private sector. I think it would be absolutely horrendous and terrible if we as a society gave up our public sector capability to collect statistical data. That would be horrific. And we need to make sure, much like we have public libraries, which were kind of the answer to, in the 19th century, to spreading knowledge, and the public postal system, we today need a public data collection institution.
If I may, a very quick reaction. I think I agree up to a point to the kind of capabilities that Europe needs, because I think that in the end we have to look at where the gatekeepers sit, and so the people that, or the entities that can actually switch off, switch on, access, and without making too much distinction between whether it's very high-tech or low-tech, commodified or not. It's like any other technology. So we want to build machines or airplanes. Can we actually do it independently, or is there somebody who has a veto or a possibility of influencing deeply our technology? So I don't know exactly, I don't want to make specific examples, but I think that we have to be very pragmatic, very realistic, saying, cloud, is cloud only Azure and Amazon and Google? Is that it? It's fine that if everything is there, we are heading in that direction. I think Germany too. Essentially, the cloud is going to be essentially US-based cloud. Is that exactly what is in Europe's interest? So I wonder whether we also need some industrial policies that nurture and sustain, exactly like the US did, because they always do, sustain this kind of more commodified technology.
I think I need to react to that, if I may, with an actual story. We hear a lot today about the need to break up Google or Microsoft or whatever. And the example that is often used is AT&T. And the breakup in the 1980s. The reality is in the 1980s, AT&T was broken up, and today it is larger than it ever has been. So that breaking up doesn't really work that well. However, in the 1950s, AT&T was already facing antitrust and competition investigations by the US federal government. We often forget about that. And in the 1950s, the US government sued AT&T, and AT&T later settled. And the key of the settlement was that all of the patents that the Bell Laboratories had, including the patents for the transistor, would be opened up and made license-free to everybody. And that, in one fell swoop, created Silicon Valley. Because that moment, the startup companies said, now we can take the transistor and create the integrated circuit. And they did. And it's this kind of, I think, public sector donation. It was a donation, the public, through public regulation, public sector regulation, Bell Labs was forced to donate that kind of knowledge to the public domain. And that kind of donation created an innovation boost and an innovation dividend that was significant. That's the kind of industrial policy that we need.
Alessandro, do you want to add some comments or other points?
No, I have no specific comment. I think that it's very ambitious, your idea. It's very ambitious because it seems to me that at the moment, the European Union have a sort of different kind of approaches in many cases. Also, this case on the cloud is quite evident. And so the question is, do you think that the new European Union, considering also different political context, will be able to put in practice this kind of approach? Or at the end, the European Union risks to remain with high skill inside a small sector, but with low benefit of this high skill?
I do think that the real dynamic will begin on a national level. And when you consider that the Social Democratic Party in Germany won the election yesterday, and the Social Democratic Party in December of 2019 passed a resolution saying that the Social Democratic Party's goal in the digital domain is a law mandating access to data, then my hope is that we will see some action in Germany from Olaf Scholz as the designated chancellor and successor of Angela Merkel. So I am always an optimist. I always hope that we can get ourselves out of the precarious situation that we have put ourselves in. But then I am an aging white male, and hope is the only thing that I have left.
I don't think so. Any questions from the audience? Okay. Looks like we have no questions. So, if no other comments are coming from the podium, I want to thank the people present here at the Politecnico and also the people who followed the meeting through the internet. Thank you all, and we invite you again to read this book published by Egia Bocconi, Fuori, dati, rompere i monopoli sulle informazioni per rilanciare il progresso. Thank you.